He dropped the iron bar exhausted and limped back to his chair. He wiped the blood off of his face with his sleeve and closed his eyes. It was only after sitting there like that for a few moments, his breath gradually slowing, that he started to realize what he'd just done. He opened his eyes and saw the mess on the floor and retched. It was barely recognizable as a human form anymore. The limbs twisted and turned in the wrong directions. The head flattened out and split open on the top. It was much worse than when his brother had exploded. He looked away. Had he done that? How Dontic was a skilled and seasoned fighter, much stronger than he was when Dontic had grabbed his shoulder. He'd been paralyzed with pain. No, he couldn't have done this. He couldn't have gotten away with it. But if not him, then who? And where was his brother? Was this really happening, or was it just what they wanted him to believe? Shane, he said. His comlink suddenly crackled. Tanner's voice, unless it was someone pretending to be Tanner. Ed, me, please, spawn. Hennis. He went to the screen, which was now splattered with blood. Tanner, he said. I've lost Shane. Ah, said Tanner. Hennessy saw his face for just a minute on the scanner, looking grim. Then a startled expression crossed Tanner's face, and he was drowned out in static. Hennessy turned away from the control panel to see just behind him his brother. Shane, he said, and smiled. You're all right after all. Of course I am, Jim, he said. You don't think a little thing like that could hurt me, do you? It must have been a trick, Hennessy told himself. His brother leaned against the control panel and stared down at him. I need to speak seriously with you, Jim, he said. What is it, Shane? Asked Hennessy. You know you can talk to me about anything. His dead brother looked straight at him, his face thoughtful, just as it had often been before when they were younger. You did good, brother, you stopped him, said Shane. But this is a very dangerous time. You are too close to be able to hear clearly. The whispers, they may take you. You mustn't listen to them, Jim. Get free, stay clear, keep your mind to yourself, or you may be no more. Tell all the others the same. But I don't, Hennessy stuttered, groping for words. I have to be honest, Shane. I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're talking about. Let them know, said Shane. The marker is the past, and the past must remain undisturbed. If we are to continue as we are, you have already awakened it. It calls out for you even now. But you must not obey. You must not listen. Tell them that. Who am I supposed to tell? Asked Hennessy. Everybody, said Shane. Tell everybody. But why don't you tell them, Shane? He asked. You know so much more about it than I do. But Shane just shook his head. It's already begun, he said. He reached out and touched his thumb to Hennessy's forehead. His touch burned like ice, and then as Hennessy watched, his brother slowly faded and was gone. Chapter 21. He felt barefoot and very lonely. He went to the observation porthole, slipping on the carcass on the floor on the way. Somebody should move that, he thought. The whole cabin reeked of blood. Maybe Shane's out there, he thought, like he was before, but all he could see was the murky water cut through by the light and the edge of the marker. Yes, it was definitely glowing now, its light pulsing slightly. He stared at it. It was trying to tell him something. What had Shane said? That it had to be left alone, that they didn't need to understand it. But why then? Did he feel like he wanted to understand it, like he wanted to learn from it? Maybe Shane had been wrong. He stared and stared. For a moment he felt he could hear a voice again, maybe Shane's voice, but then it grew softer and softer and was gone. And then suddenly the glow grew brighter, and it was as if his head had been cracked open and filled with light. He whirled around, his eyes darting back and forth. He needed to get it all down. He needed to record everything it was telling him. He could type it all into the computer, but that wasn't enough. There could be a power failure, and then everything would be lost. No, he needed to write it, but he didn't have a pen, a pencil, paper. He hadn't used actual paper since he was a child. The computer would have to do. On his way back to it, he slipped again and went partly down, soaking his knee and his hand in gore. He looked at his hand dripping with blood, its blood double inscribed right on the flesh of his thigh, and then he knew what to do. He dipped his finger in Dantek's blood and approached the walls, waiting for his mind to crack open again. When it did, it flared with symbols. He could see them perfectly in his head, shimmering there frantically. He began to jolt them on the walls, writing as quickly as he could, stopping only to dip his fingers in blood again. At first, there was something like an N, but only backward, with a bead on the bottom of its leg. Then an L, but upside down with a horizontal bar crimped. Then something that looked like the prow of a ship moving left to right. A port hole just visible, and a circle within a circle. After that he was writing fiercely trying to keep up with the figures streaming through his head that he couldn't keep track, could only let his fingers trace out the pattern and move on. When he hit the porthole, he didn't stop, just wrote right over it. Anything that got in the way, he wrote on. After a while, he was running out of space and started writing smaller so that there'd be enough room. When he ran out of room on the walls, he wrote on and under the instrument panels. When he ran low on blood, he stomped on what was left of Dantek's chest, trying to force more out, but only a little came out. So he stomped on a limb hard, and blood began to leach out. Before too long, Dantek's blood had been torn to pieces, looking even less human than when he started. The comm unit crackled, sending out an angry hiss of static. "Inco F7 Othersh," it said. "Not now, Tanner," he said back. Income. Oh, you said. "Not now," he shouted. The ceiling was already covered with walls, where already covered all that was left was the floor. He piled the pieces of Dantek's body in the command chair. He tried to strap them in, but quickly realized it was useless. That was all right, he told himself. The vessel wasn't moving. They weren't going anywhere. There was hardly any blood left, and what was left on the floor was beginning to clot. He dipped his finger in it, kept writing in light wispy strokes, conserving the blood, but very quickly he ran out of floor. He wished Shane were there to tell him what to do next. Had he done the right thing? Had he betrayed his brother? He stayed there on his knees, staring. It was hot, almost too hot to bear. How could it be so hot? He stood up and took off his shirt, threw it on the floor chair. It helped a little, but not enough. He was still hot. He took off his shoes, piled them on top of the shirt, then took off his pants, his underwear. Naked, he stared down at his body. Pale, he thought. White as a sheet. Not a sheet, he corrected. White as paper, and then he knew where he would write next. Only there wasn't any more blood. He used all of Dantek's up. He hadn't saved enough to write the ending. He looked around. Surely there was more blood here somewhere. Didn't they travel with bags of blood? What if they needed to do an onboard transfusion? How could they go anywhere without blood? His eyes were scanning over the room, searching. When they passed over his arm, saw the pulse of a vein. "Ah," he said, breaking into a smile. "That's where you're hiding. There you are." It wasn't easy to get the blood to come out. In the end, he managed to tear the arm open with the sharp corner of the same strut he had used to disply Dantek. At first the blood came readily, and he could simply rub the finger against his arm and then inscribe a symbol on his body. But quickly the wound slowed and began to clot. He had to tear it open again, and then a third time. By the time he was done, it was as if he himself had become a representation of the marker. He was beautiful, covered with a swarm of symbols, all the knowledge of the universe expressed on the surface of his skin. He stood straight, arms to his sides, and held still. He was the marker. He could feel its power flowing through him. How long he was like that, he couldn't say. He was snapped out of it by a sharp noise and an intense pain in his head. He swayed and fell down, clutching his temples. When the noise finally stopped, he stood and stumbled up. He had more to do. He remembered confusedly. He had to tell them. He had to warn them. He turned on the video screen and stood in front of it, set it to simultaneously record and to broadcast on all frequencies. The messages was for everyone. Shane had been clear about that. He needed to tell everyone if the message could get through the rock and muck at all. "Hello," he said to the video screen. "Officer James Hennessy here, acting commander of the SS Marker. I've been informed by my brother Shane that there's something we all need to know." There was a stabbing pain in his head, as if someone were prodding his optic nerve with the tip of a dull knife. He clutched his head and leaned on the counter. After the pain had passed, he stood there for a moment, unsure of where he was. He opened his eyes and looked around him, unable to take it all in. And then suddenly he remembered he was on TV. He gave the camera his most winning smile. What was he doing again? Oh yes, that's right, he was saving humanity. "We've heard the wrong whispers," he started. "There's little time and we're listening to what they say, but Shane says we should not obey. We are not following the right answers. We have to resist the past before it is too late. Too late for convergence." He gave his winning smile again, looking straight and intensely into the camera. Anyone watching would realize he was talking directly to them. They had to understand how important this was. "I've drawn a map," he said, gesturing to his body. "I don't know if that's what Shane wants, but I looked at the marker and looked at it, and then I had to draw. We need to change our ways and learn to understand it," he said. He shook his head, confused. Had he gotten off track somewhere, or else not understanding it? He said it was like there were two forces inside him fighting to claim him, and he was no longer sure which was which, and which he should listen to. The marker caught his eye through the porthole. He watched it pulse a long moment. He looked at his left hand, then looked at his right hand, and slowly brought them together in front of him. "Convergence," he said. He just gestured at the marker through the porthole, then gestured at the symbols on his own body. "We need to understand it," he said, even though a part of him was screaming at him to stop. "That's the only thing that's important right now, to learn from it. It is the way we need to understand it, not destroy it." He backed away and turned the video off. He was so tired now, his head hurt. He needed to rest. He would rest for just a minute and then head for home. He lay down on the floor. He felt both hot and cold. His bare body felt unnatural against the smooth floor. Slowly he folded it in on himself until he was curled into a ball and started to shiver. At the end, he had a brief moment of lucidity when he realized that he was tired because the oxygen was running out. When he realized that something else had controlled everything, he had done everything he had said. But by the time he realized this, it was far too late to do anything about it. "I'll get up in a moment," he thought. "I'll get up and drill my way back up to the surface, and then I'll sort this mess out." A moment later, he collapsed into unconsciousness. Not long after, he was dead.